Hi, Anu.
Hello, Janaki.
Thanks for agreeing to this interview.
Thank you for having me.
Okay,
One of
let
the
me.
wild women.
Yes, let me introduce Annu Jalais, right? Have I
Yes.
got it correct? Okay.
Annu Jalais.
Annu Jalais is an anthropologist who studies the
Jalais.
relationship between humans and non-humans and the implications of religious and caste identities as well as climate change. I first came to know of her work through her 2005 article called Dwelling on Morichapi, When Tigers Become Citizens, Refugees Tiger Food. I had been following the course of wildlife conservation efforts for about a decade by then, and nothing I had read had shaken me quite as much as this article. Anu wrote a book in 2010 about the dynamics of people and tigers in a book called Forest of Tigers, People, Politics, and Environment in the Sundarbans. One of the first things that pops up in our minds when we think of Sundarbans is its man-eating tigers. But what are the tales that people of this area, of this mangrove area, narrate to make sense of that dangerous world? How does wildlife conservation, especially of tigers, play out when there's such extreme poverty and hardship? Anu will take us through these issues in this interview. Oh no, let me start by asking you, who are your heroes in real life?
My heroes are Dr. Ambedkar, my parents, and professors who have inspired me. Professor Henrietta Moore, for example, Professor Franz Bhattacharya. So these are the people who, and many others, Professor Shiva Ramakrishnan, for example, also. And so these are my real life heroes.
Great. What book are you reading right now?
At the moment, I'm reading this book called Kwaho Fove by Natasha Martin. So she's an anthropologist who got attacked by a bear in the Kamacha Mountains. So I'm reviewing this book, and I'm enjoying it.
Do you see any parallels with your work in the Sundarbans?
This is something that could have happened to me in the Sundarban with the tigers. So I find some kindred spirit in here.
Right. So now with the pandemic and everything, the lockdown, what is your current state of mind?
I've been feeling really worried for all the people I know who live in the Sundarban. And I've been in touch with them from the time of the lockdown, actually even before the lockdown, talking about this disease, explaining things, getting a lot of feedback from what was happening, what were people doing. And especially around Amphan, I've been on the phone quite a lot with them. Initially, for the first 5 days after the cyclone, I couldn't get through, but then the towers were working again, and I could call them.
Great. You've had such a long relationship with the Sundarbans. How did it begin?
It's even longer than you think. I went to the Sundarban as a child, as a 7-year-old, with my parents for 2 winters to this island called Bashanti. And we went to visit their friends and colleagues because they all worked in this Indian NGO called Seva Sangho Samiti. And so that's how it started. My parents, we were living in a place called Shalkia, which is on the other side of Calcutta, on the other side of the Hooghly River. So Shalkia in Howrah, and basically our next door neighbors were fishermen from the Sundarban. So he had this tiny mud hut, next to the house where we lived. And I used to play with his kids. So this is how I got more stories about the Sundarban. The other person who, as a child, told me a lot about the Sundarban was this woman called Savitri Lucy Singh, who used to work for Seva Sangho Samiti. And she used to often go to the Sundarban to work on development projects with my parents. And she used to come back with extraordinary stories about the region. And I used to love her a lot. And she used to come to our house and tell me stories about this place. So, and the other aspect, I went to the Sundarban on a nature study camp when I was in class 7 in 1988. And it was a couple of weeks before the big cyclone of 88, where about 10,000 people died. Between 8 and 10,000 people died. Yes, before 2000, the cyclones used to kill people in their thousands. There were no cyclone shelters, and that's when the NGO and my parents' work decided to build the first cyclone shelter. And my father sort of collected money, and with his friend Shobunlal Banerjee built the first cyclone shelter of the Sundarban. So it got built and in the early 90s. There are some people that I had met during this camp that that died in this cyclone. So I think this place has remained very present throughout my childhood. And what had happened during this nature study camp was that we had met a few scientists, and they had told us that they were advising the government on what to do to sort of tone down the man-eating aspects of the tiger. And so they had started building freshwater ponds inside the forest, distributing gur or molasses in certain areas to sweeten the tiger's nature. They had put some electrified dummies inside the forest. And I don't know how they did that, because the tide sort of washes everything off twice a day. But, and the other thing that they had done was distribute masks. And I remember early morning, my friend Shujata Ghosh and myself, we asked the guards if we could wear those masks and go into the forest, because we had been told that the islanders were refusing to wear those masks because they were superstitious. So we told the guards, we're not. You can lend us a couple of masks and we could go into the forest. And the guard said, those masks are not for you, they're for the islanders. So I had wanted to return to ask why the islanders were refusing to wear these masks. So this is how I got, this is my long-standing relationship with the Sundarban. I had also read a few books as a kid on the region, and had always been, it's like perhaps for any child growing up in Kolkata, the Sundarban is the Wild West, in a way. It is the frontier between what one considers, sort of city life, civilized life, and beyond. So it's a place that has always drawn me.
It sounds like a dangerous place to be, not just for the tigers. You were talking about cyclones killing thousands of people. So what was it about the place that captivated you, that led you to a career in studying people, tiger or wildlife dynamics in this area?
So what I was completely fascinated by this place, as I was telling you. And initially I was studying literature, and I had the first place where I had done fieldwork as an undergrad was North Bangladesh, Assam, and North West Bengal. And it was collecting women's songs, Bhavaiya songs. And I came back and gave these, presented these songs to my professor, France Bhattacharya, who was a big inspiration. She introduced me to Bengali literature in Paris, after doing Bengali literature, of course, in Kolkata, while I was growing up. So she said, Anu, because those songs, I had translated them and I had explained them, but I was a lot more interested in the women's lives, the women who sung these songs, what was the background of these songs, why were they singing them, what was the meaning behind these songs. And she said, you should get into anthropology. And it was around the same time, this was in 96, that I read In an Antique Land by Amitav Ghosh, and I suddenly discovered this discipline. And I applied to the London School of Economics. And I had read Death in Benares by Professor Jonathan Perry. And in there, he argues that, for a Hindu person, the best place to die really is Benares, because you end the cycle of birth and death. And I remember sending this proposal in saying, okay, if the best place to die is Benares, how do you explain people who die in the Sundarbans, and how do they make sense of their deaths? What is their death all about? And initially, that is what I wanted to find out. I wanted to find out more about the history of the place, how people lived with each other, communities, castes, all of that. And it was only when I was there that I got interested really in the forest and in wild animals.
Right. I would imagine doing field work would have been very hard in a place like that. So how did you manage?
It was very, very hard. But as I said, I think that because I spend a lot of holidays in deltaic Bengal, I was used to the kind of hardship I came across when I did fieldwork in the Sundarban. So, for example, we would go every weekend to a place called Kollanpur, which is on the Hotor line, just a station after Baripur. And this is about 30 kilometers from Calcutta. It's around where the Dampier-Hodges line starts, and so I grew up, basically knowing how to jump in a pond to shower and, go into the fields very early morning to defecate because there weren't always toilets. This was the case also when I reached the Sundarban. And I knew, I knew the language, I knew how to behave, I knew a lot of codes of conduct that I think are important for an anthropologist. But I still found it very, very difficult, very lonely. I think a lot of anthropologists suffer from loneliness in the field. And physically, I lost a lot of weight, even though I seem to eat well. But it was, in those days, it wasn't like it is now. This was 21 years ago, in 99, when I went to do my field work. Things were a lot tougher. People spoke about hunger, starvation quite a lot. You could see people's bodies, they were half the size, half the weight of people in Kolkata. Very, very skinny people, very muscular, those who had enough to eat, but otherwise, you could see that this place, that this was a place where people were hungry. So it was a tough field work.
Sounds it. So when did you first hear of Morichapi?
So I first heard of Morichapi in 99, 20 years after Morichapi, the Mojave Massacre had happened. So I was coming back from one of these late night theatrical shows called the Jatra. And I was walking back with a group of young men, and they had noticed that I wasn't going to the forest, that I kept to the village. And so this man said, so what do you do? And I said, well, I've come to write about your history with all the confidence that people in their 20s have. And he said, really? You're writing about us? And I said, yes. And he said, but aren't we just tiger food for you lot? And that stayed with me. So I started prodding and asking why he thought that that people from Kolkata and beyond might think that those who live in the Sundarban are just tiger food. And so this led me to being a lot more sensitive and conscious about this. And in that conversation that night, he spoke about Morichapi, and he said, tigers weren't so violent, and they were fine creatures. It was only after Morichapi that they started feeding on us, that they started attacking us. And even though I had heard of Morichapi, I had never registered it. And that's when I started asking more questions, what really happened? And why do you think tigers became man-eaters after that time? So this is how I got interested in this massacre.
So
If you
could
want
you
me
tell
to
us,
tell.
yeah, just briefly what happened? What is the history of the massacre?
So basically, if the higher caste Hindus had left East Pakistan or East Bengal before the Indian partition, before the partition of India, in the 1930s and 40s, it was only in the 1950s and 60s and even in the 70s that people from the lower castes, subaltern communities, started leaving East Pakistan. And Jyoti Basu, who then became chief minister of West Bengal, but was then the leader of the opposition, had promised in a few of his speeches that he would make sure that our refugee brethren would get a space in West Bengal so that they do not have to live in these far off camps of Dandakaranya, which were spread out over Andhra Pradesh, Orissa, Madhya Pradesh, and the Andaman Islands. So he said, I'm going to make sure that all of these refugees are going to come back to the land of Bengal, and we are going to give them space in one of the islands of the Sundarban. And the island that he was referring to was Morichapi, which was a plantation island full of coconut and tamarisk trees, chhau gach in Bengali. So it had been cleared of the forest, at least in the northern half of the island. And it wasn't as if it was an island in the middle of the forest. It was an island that was just south of the inhabited islands, just south and just east of the island where I did field work. So it would have been an extension. So he had initially said that that they would get a place on that island. And what happened was, to everybody's surprise, he formed the government, the Left Front government, and in December 77, and the refugees started to take him at his word and just travel back. And it seems that some 35,000 refugees came and settled on Morichapi and on some of the islands around Morichapi. And these are people who knew people from the Sundarban. They were people of the same castes, of the same communities. They were people who had long-standing relationships, people who had come from this place in Bangladesh called Koira, Betkashi, and other places from Khulna and Shatkhira. So they all knew each other, and people talk a lot about solidarity and how they had come brought by the British 200 years before these people, and they had tried to make this place home. And what had allowed them to make this place home was the tigers. I'm coming to this story later. But also, so basically they thought that, they should be allowed in, and they should be allowed to settle on this revenue generating non-forested island of Morichapi. And Indira Gandhi, who was then the prime minister, did not want that. And she made sure, and Jyoti Basu basically reneged on his word, and the island was encircled by the police. The media wasn't really allowed in, and people were shot at. So they couldn't go and fetch fresh water from the adjoining islands. And they talk about how they felt completely betrayed by that event because they were just, their huts were broken up. And these people in 2 years' time, between December 77 and 79, had managed to set up schools, dispensaries, even put a few water pumps, and had organized themselves quite well. And they were just kicked out, packed up in lorries, sent back to their various camps. And some of them ran away and are living along the embankments of islands, just north and east of Morichapi. So this is what happened then. And that remains a big betrayal. And people kept telling me, had we been high caste Hindus, had we been from the same castes as the Bhadralok, who are sitting and making these governmental decisions, we would not have been kicked out of this place. It was just because, we are Dalits that we were just kicked out and made to live elsewhere. And basically our Bengali identity was not really, given any respect.
So how many people died in that massacre?
So I went to some camps in Dandakaranya to find out, and I came across a couple of books that the victims have written about this massacre, and they have spoken about at least 200 people dying directly from the police firing and from things like dysentery in the couple of months that led to this massacre. But some say that many more died. When I wrote that article you were citing, Ashok Mitro, who is an economist I have always had a lot of regard for, he said that no, it was hyperbole about massacre, what I had written, and only 2 people had died. So I then I wrote a rejoinder saying that he could go and look at these books by the victims of Morichapi, and he would find the list of all the people who had been killed in the police firing. But what happened was that firing did not just instill a sense of betrayal amongst people who left the place. It also instilled a sense of betrayal amongst those who remained in the other islands, because they said that with this massacre, suddenly the tigers became very self-important. This massacre went to tigers' heads. They realized that they were first-class citizens and that they were just second-class citizens. And this is why this remark by this young man, aren't we just tiger food for you? So this idea that basically this is a godforsaken place where nobody wants to live and nobody wants to really think of, care for. That's the idea.
So there was also the way people saw the incident shaped the way they saw tigers. They said that this is the incident that turned them into man-eaters, even though we can argue that they were probably man-eaters for a lot longer. So what about this incident? Is it just that the tigers got arrogant and thought, hey, if people don't respect these people, we might as well eat them? Or I read that there was this whole thing about you have to enter the Sundarbans with a pure heart and empty hands, and this massacre completely desecrated the forest. I couldn't get over that, the fact that they saw the forest as a temple, as a sacred place that had been defiled.
Totally, exactly. And what is for me very, very interesting is that the forest really is considered as a sacred space. And it is not so much the language of Hinduism. So people don't really talk about the forest as a temple, because as a Dalit, you're not even allowed in many temples. But it was called the sacred land, it was called an egalitarian sacred place that had been made sacred because this superpower had been sent by Allah to save people. And this superpower called Bonbibi, she had come from Mecca and Medina, had brought some holy land from their earth and had mixed it to the land of the 18 tides. And that this was why when you entered the forest, you had to be egalitarian, like the Muslims. You couldn't believe in caste and community or gender distinctions or distinctions between humans and non-humans. And people are always very, very clear about this. Even, you know, so people have these long lists that they follow to the letter. So I remember, you know, I lived there for 2 continuous years, and one of my friends and this tiger charmer, I once asked him, you know, would you be ready to basically take me in as a disciple of yours, make me a tiger charmer? And he said, yes, of course I would, but you would have to do 2 things: give up your job and stop eating crabs. And I asked why, and he said, okay, crabs will make you, we basically need to follow the Islamic rules of eating. So crabs are makruh, you know, it's not really haram, but it'll make you deaf, so you can't. But the job means a steady income.
Sorry,
So
what is
as
a
long
tiger charmer?
A tiger charmer. So the place is there are quite a few tiger charmers, and the British made fun of these people by calling them, you know, these superstitious, arrogant people who think that they can charm tigers and who go into the forests with lead these men into the forest. And then you often have in a lot of these gazetteers, you know, a mockery of the tiger charmer, saying, he's the first one to be killed. And so I used to often hang out with the tiger charmers because I found it, I really wanted to understand what was behind them doing this. What did it involve? Because it was not something that was passed down from father to son. You had it in you to become a tiger charmer, or you didn't. And you had it in you if you were a very courageous person, but also tinted with arrogance, because you thought you could stand up to the tiger. You thought that, you know, you can basically challenge the tiger. And so these men, the first ones to get off the boat, they usually put their hand on a lump of earth, and you know, they put their hands in this way. They say a whole lot of prayers, and if they feel that the place is safe, and what they say they do is that they basically they control tigers. So they make the tiger either feel drowsy or ticklish or run away as if his body were on fire, and they have to make sure, once everybody has, you know, finished chopping trees down and whatever, taking the honey, that and they're the last ones to get up in the boat again, because they need to cut these charms. You know, they need to stop these charms having effect, because you need to release the tigers. And they say, we are the ones getting off the boat first before we can even say these charms. So yeah, the tiger attacks us first, and then once we've stopped saying these charms, we are still on the ground because we're the last person getting into the boat. So yes, but we know that we are sort of sacrificial victims. We take on the responsibility of being these people who stand up to tigers. But in this whole idea of tigers, you know, it's a beautiful long story where I don't like to call her a goddess. So the Hindus see her as a goddess, the Muslims see her as the superpower, and she is venerated by Muslims, and I choose my word and not say worship. And so you find a lot of shrines, both in Bangladesh and in West Bengal, by Muslim communities where she's not represented, but you know it's a shrine. So you have earthen mounds, and within a little, you know, enclosure, and people are going to tell you that this is a Bonbibi Than, and the Muslims I spoke to, talked about it as a sign of respect. They say, we love our parents, we venerate them, we show them respect. This is what we do to this superpower called Bonbibi, who was sent by Allah. So this is also what we do towards our Sufi saints and their tombs. So they were very they were very careful to sort of explain how it was very different from being worshippers. And so basically this entity of Bonbibi unites both Hindus, Muslims, Christians, and even animists, because there are many Adivasi communities there. So before you go to the forest, you actually put a few flowers, say a few charms, and then go to the forest. And the whole idea is that if you are a crab collector or a fisher, you do not have much power. And then your prayer is all about being humble and telling Ma Bonbibi, listen, I have nothing left at home. I have no land. I have no ways of making a living. And I need to go into your granary to basically feed my family. Whereas if you go in as a woodcutter, then you go in with a lot of pride and arrogance, because wood belongs to the tiger and you're not supposed to take it. And so this is where you sort of see the tiger as, an alter ego in a way, because you have to match the tiger's arrogance. And this is what people often talked about. The tiger is this very, very arrogant animal. And you have to, on the one hand, tell them, listen, I'm doing this because there is no other way for me to survive. But you also have to stand up to it. So you have to find this balance between being humble enough and arrogant enough to be able to be a good tiger charmer. So you need a tiger charmer if you go into the forest to chop wood or collect honey. You don't need a tiger charmer if you go to collect crab or fish. And so there's this distinction between the two. But so the Sundarban tigers have always killed people. François Bernier, who went there in the 17th century, speaks about tigers being man-eaters in the Sundarban. And some scientists in the 1970s, like Hubert Hendricks, for example, gave it a lot of thought and wondered why, these tigers were not like the tigers of Kumau and really were creatures that went for humans, swam over villages, took people from boats, from houses, and swam back with them into the forest. And so some people say that it's because perhaps of the fact that twice a day the tide water washes any demarcating line, any territory the tiger might have, demarcating its own territory, which is what tigers seemingly do in other parts. So they don't have an idea of fixed boundaries and they swim anywhere. Others say that it is perhaps because the water is very brackish and they need, fresh water. There was even a paper saying that they need human blood for dietary balance. So whether it's that, we do not know, but what we do know is that tigers in the Sundarban have never really, backed out from attacking humans when they can. Right. So Morichapi, people say that it was on two levels that tigers became man-eaters. One was because all these corpses killed by the police firing were going down the river and got caught in the mangroves, and the tiger tasted that human flesh, got a taste for it, and came and attacked humans. So that is one argument. The other argument is that it got to their head. They realized, wow, we are creatures that the government is happy protecting over humans. And that is what a lot of the islanders spoke about. This is of course, not everybody believes so. And it was very interesting once to even talk to a poacher and asked him his views about Bonbibi. And he said, He said in Bangla, Bonbibi patta dilo kon sarkar. So who gave Bonbibi the lease of the land? So I said, what do you mean? And he said, are you crazy? I cannot worship Bonbibi. She's good for the little guys. She's good for, the crab collectors. I'm a poacher. I need Kali. I need Makali. So anyway, this was, for me, it was fascinating to live there and find out, how people made sense of their world. And this brought me to a huge realization, really, on the non-human. And I stopped talking. In my book, I talk about the non-human and not the animal. And I think in the South Asian sphere, I was reading a lot of Philippe Descola, who was talking about the Amazon forest and how the Achuar consider jaguars as their brothers, and how they feel that they can become jaguars and jaguars can become human. And here I was getting stories about tigers being actually these very cantankerous but also very generous souls. So people would say, these poor tigers, they were kicked away from Southeast Asia and they had nowhere to go. They trekked and were kicked off from every place they went. And finally they arrived in these godforsaken islands of the Sundarban. And they were happy to stay here, even though the water is so brackish and things are very difficult, with the tide basically washing their forest twice a day. And when we came, tigers allowed us because they knew that, like them, we had been refugees. We had nowhere else to go. So in a way, they understand us and we understand them. And this is where I thought, okay, Annu, you need to rethink how you think animals, because this is completely new. This is a way of talking about the non-human world that is not at all Judeo-Christian, where you have an idea of, the human being superior and being very distinct, right? Culture distinct from nature. Here you have a world where the environment is all about, the two cohabiting, and you didn't have the humans that were on the one hand, the hunters, and on the other hand, these protectors of the forest. You had these humans saying, we are living with these creatures and these creatures are arrogant and this is how we handle them. And this is how they handle us, because in a lot of the stories they told me, tigers had human voices. Tigers came over to their villages, and tigers sometimes took the form of a storm, sometimes came in visions and told them what to do. So, these were creatures that had feelings, that had emotions, that weren't. So basically, they were sensitized to the natural world in a way that was very, very different from the ways in which we grow up thinking of the natural world. Here, you are part of the natural world in a way, and you try to make sense of it as a human. But as a human, you don't necessarily think that you are superior to the natural world, and that is what I found fascinating. And this is what I am still working on.
So just to clarify one thing, so was the massacre at Morichapi, were they using the tiger or conservation as an excuse to clear the island of people?
Exactly. Basically, that's what they said. And they were afraid. I think also they didn't realize how difficult it is to take over islands in the Sundarban. So the Dampier-Hodges line in the 1870s came about. So the line comes 30 kilometers south of Calcutta. That was the entire area, okay, north of that was under the permanent settlement, brought and basically had a different taxation system to everything else. You didn't have to pay as much taxes, and you basically had to build these huge embankments around each island, because you have to imagine these islands as if floating on water. And very often, so when the tide is high, if you have not gotten an embankment around the island, the water basically washes over the island. And this is what happens every time there's a breach in an embankment. Water streams in and basically kills everything. Everything rots. If you go 3 days after a cyclone where an embankment has been breached, it stinks of all the dead fish from the ponds. It stinks of dead plants. Everything just rots, okay, in the brackish water. So one has to be very, very careful as to keep these islands, the embankments around these islands, maintained so that they do not break, because then it's the end of life for humans in these inhabited islands. Now, Morichapi was already an island with embankments for this plantation. So it wasn't as if, so I think people elsewhere don't realize that. So they must have thought, okay, if we allow these people, there are more people that are going to come and take over more islands from the Sundarban, but from the forested areas. But basically you can't, because it really needs, it needs a lot of money, it needs a lot of foresight, it needs a lot of manpower to be building these huge big embankments. And this is why the forested islands have remained the same in the last 50 years. You cannot take over a forested island in the Sundarban.
Right. And I think, yeah, you're right. People don't realize that. There's always talk of encroachments in the forest.
Yeah.
So, but despite the difficulty that you mentioned in taking over these forested islands, there was, and the Sundarbans also became a World Heritage Site. There was different plans then to create a power plant and then a Sahara city over the years. None of that came to happen, but what were they thinking? If we are protecting this as an ecological asset, how did the government justify its plans?
I think, Janaki, this is a very good question. I think that over the years, unfortunately, it's always been that people who live in the Sundarban are seen as disposable and as not important enough. So it suited the government to say that this was a forested region that one had to respect in the late 70s. And it suited the government in the late 90s when I started asking questions about development, embankments. They said, people should never have been brought there. So we are hoping that they just leave. We are not going to really develop this place. And electricity in the island where I did fieldwork, for example, only came 2 years back. So you can imagine the evenings, right? With snakes and all kinds of. So basically, this whole idea, of suddenly thinking, okay, we'll generate a lot of money via tourism by having this Sahara city where we can offer scuba diving in a place full of crocodiles, in a place where the water is so brown that you can't really see through in most parts. This is full of very, very heavy silt. So how do you, and there is now a coal power plant in the Bangladesh side of, the region just north of the Sundarban forest in a place called Rampal, just 30 kilometers away. Again, built with 50% with Indian cooperation and money and all of that. So they were able to do that, right? Who knows what crazy idea they're going to come up with. But for example, on the other hand, since Amitabh Ghosh's lovely book, The Hungry Tide, there have been increasing number of tourists each year to the Sundarban.
Really?
And so there are hotels everywhere, something that didn't exist 20 years back, not a restaurant, not a hotel in a lot of the southern islands. And the only place one could go was in Shojne Khali, which had a tourist lodge, that was government owned. Now you have all these private lodges that have come up, owned by people from Kolkata and elsewhere. Why is the government not taxing these lodges? Why are we not seeing a greater control of who is building a lodge there? and basically taxing the people who have put all these lodges, making sure that they don't use plastic or styrofoam. The place is getting filthier by the day because of styrofoam, plastic, all of that brought by the tourists or to feed the tourists on boats and in these lodges, and nothing is being done about that. So this is what I don't understand. The government could make quite a lot of money actually taxing these lodges.
Right. So what is the future then, as you see it, for the Sundarbans? I mean, given climate change and the rising sea levels, what's the vision?
So, unfortunately, I think there isn't a vision. I think there should be a lot more talk with Bangladesh. Every time I go to Bangladesh, just to the region just north of the Sundarban forest, their embankments, were built in the 60s, were built with foreign money, but are 2-3 times the size of the ones we have in West Bengal. These are huge, big embankments. A lot of them are mud embankments, but they have been built, with cars in mind. The whole area in Bangladesh seems, and it's even less populated than in India. So it's not as if because you've developed that place that people have stayed back or that you have more people living there. No. The place is quite barren, but you have these amazing big embankments in mud in a lot of places, and sometimes in brick and concrete that protect islands. Whereas in the West Bengal part, you have so little money spent, and sometimes it is even returned on the embankment, and they're built so badly. Recently a young friend sent me a video of an embankment that had just been built after Amphan had made a breach in the embankment in Rangabelia. And he showed me, he said, look at this. The embankment had been breached. The irrigation guys had come and built an embankment that was lower than the highest level of high tide. And so basically the water just came back on top. And basically those guys had left before the high tide came. So what do you do? How do you make people accountable? How do you make a government accountable when this is a place where anybody who comes to work there just think of leaving it? So 20 years ago, people who got a job as school teachers or health workers used to actually stay there because it was so difficult to access it. Now, all the school teachers that work in the various schools of the Sundarban return every day to the outskirts of Calcutta. And this is causing a lot of anxiety and anger amongst a lot of islanders who say, why can't they stay with us? Why can't they set up home and leave only on the weekends? Why do they need to make this trip every day? So on the one hand, transport is much better than it was 20 years ago. But on the other hand, it seems that nothing really has been done about the embankments and how they could be, made more stable. So I have heard recently, over the last decade, a lot of experts talking about the fact that that the Sundarban shouldn't really be developed because this is lost cause. What I want to argue is that between Bangladesh and India, we're talking about 13 million people, okay? Just in the Indian side, 5 million people. Where are you going to put them? And why can't we think of making these people a little more economically stable by having them, work in all kinds of little cooperatives? Why are they not trained to keep honeybees? they could be doing what other people are doing from other parts of Bengal. They come to the Sundarban for 2-3 months, put all their hives there, and then go off to Midnapur for another 3 months, and then go to Nadia for another 3 months. Why can't people in the Sundarban be doing this job and have their hives, going from one place to another? Why can't people think very creatively about this? So at the moment, the labor force from the Sundarban is mainly one that works in people's houses in Calcutta as nurses, as maids, or construction laborers all over India. If you ask people, usually they are from the Sundarban region. So, I think that anybody from there, those who can, have always left it. So all my friends who were school teachers 20 years back have all left the Sundarban. They have bought a plot of land on the outskirts of Calcutta and have left. They say it's too dangerous politically and geographically, right? If you're going to be at the mercy of an embankment breaking, you are going to leave. You are going to try and find a better place. So, but I think that not doing anything about this region is not the solution, because you still have people there. And I think that a minimum of maintaining the embankments, asking Bangladesh how they do it, how they have all these, good embankments, could perhaps be useful, and could make this region, at least could pull out the people from this region out of stark poverty, which in the last 20 years, I have to say, they have been pulled out. The present government has done quite a lot. They have performance cards where they receive 1,000 rupees every month, and when they perform, they get 2,000 rupees. They have cards now for the elderly where they get 1,000 rupees on their accounts every month. They have cards for the widows. And so the government has been, and you don't see the hunger and the starvation you saw 20 years back. But people, the population hasn't increased. People are leaving, So 20 years ago, it was a little less than 5 million. It's around 5 million now. And so this is why I think that people know that there isn't much future. But at least for those who are there, something should be done. Because it's such a waste of energy, of everything, having to rebuild this constantly because of corruption, because of all kinds of reasons. You don't have roads the width that they should be. You don't have the embankments, as high as they should be. And basically, this is something that I think could be improved.
Thanks so much, Anu. We can keep talking, but I'm afraid we're out of time. Thank you so much for talking to me.
Thank you, Janaki. Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to volume 2 of My Husband and Other Animals. When is that coming out?
2 is already out, but I'm not sure if there will be a 3.
Oh, 2 is out. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
All right. Thanks so much, Anu. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Janaki. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.